Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughn Manor, where Roger and I have returned for another comic book video. I know, you guys just can't get enough of my comic book videos. Well, here's another one. And I'm doing this video because I have gotten some comments in an email or two asking about if I was ever going to do any more DC Finest updates. And the only reason I haven't is because they've been coming so quickly. Literally every week, or almost every week, there is a new DC Finest volume. So I thought I would just take a look at the DC Finest series and talk a little bit about the series as a whole and some of the high points, I think, in this series. Some of the things I'm looking forward to in future books, and what some things that I think should be published in the DC Finest series. So DC Finest is a series of paperback collections, big fat trade paperback collections of DC Comics classic stories. They are very much modeled after Marvel's Epic Collection line. And for a long time, I have been complaining about DC Comics' Reprint program because for a long time, it sucked. And I've said that a million times, that DC Comics' Reprint program sucked. And DC Comics has such a vast library of comics that a lot of comic book readers like myself would love to see reprinted. And where over at Marvel seemed to have everything figured out. You know, their omnibus line is doing very well and has been doing very well for a while. And their Epic collections have been a tremendous success. They really have how to reprint their stuff down. They know what they're doing, Marvel. And I couldn't figure out why DC just didn't do what Marvel was doing. Well, finally they did. I'm obviously not the only person who thought this way. I don't think anybody at DC watches my dumb little channel, but obviously there are other people that felt the same. Because DC has really turned around the Reprint program big time. And with the DC Finest series, they are doing exactly what I've always wanted them to do, and what a lot of fans have always wanted them to do, is that they are reprinting a lot of great stuff. Some stuff that hasn't been reprinted in a long time, other stuff that has, but the way they're doing it now in this particular series is just fantastic. So let's talk a little bit about it and why I think the DC Finest series is so great. This is the most recent one I got. And they're at, I think, 34 volumes now. I've got every single volume that up to this point they've released. I will continue to get every single volume that they release because I've been waiting for this exact line of books forever. And when they first announced it, I was kind of wondering how it was going to be. And it's been great. It's just been fantastic. And this is a perfect example of why it's great. This is Hawkman. And first of all, the jacket design is fantastic. I love how they have the single issues on the back. That's always cool. And they've got this little chart here which shows you when the stories are in the classic DC timeline here. And the comics that they're reprinting for this series start in 1938 with Superman and go to 2011. And 2011 was the last year before the New 52 happened, and we had yet another restart of the DC universe. And so everything up to that point, which is a lot, can be printed in the DC Finest line of comics. And I have been waiting for this particular volume forever. I've been wanting them to reprint Hawkman by Gardner Fox and Joe Kubert literally for years and years. And they did come out when they were doing their black and white showcase volumes. They did come out with a couple Hawkman volumes then. But those were on cheap paper in black and white. Here we have a really nice trade paperback. It is in full color. and it looks great. It looks great. One thing that DC did have to do in some of these is they did have to do some remastering, but that's the kind of thing that once you do it, it's done, right? Hawkman was already done, I think, because of previous reprints of this stuff, even though it was very, very old. But the Hawkman stories in here are beautiful. So these volumes are very much like Marvel's Epic Collections, but they do tend to be longer. Marvel's Epic Collections tend to top out at 500 pages. It's rare for them to go any more than that, and usually they are less. This particular volume is 558 pages, and they can go up to over 600. So these are thick paperback volumes. They're not terribly expensive for what you're getting. This one ran $40 in the United States. And it's a beautiful book, and I've been waiting for it forever. And this is a perfect example of why the DC Finest is a great series. The first book in the DC Finest that was released was this one. This is Batman Year 1 and 2, comics that were frequently reprinted. But what they do in this one is they reprinted all the Batman comics from 1986 up into 1987. And the 1980s, first of all, was a great time for Batman. Starting at around the mid 1980s and up through the 1980s, we got some great Batman comics. And this reprints not just Batman Year 1 and 2, but all the other comics in between. And those were some just fantastic comics. And it looks beautiful. And there have been two Batman volumes so far. There was this one, and then they came out with this one, which has stories from 1987 to 1988, which directly follows the last one, which has The Killing Joke and other stories. And a lot of the other stories are just fantastic. This is the period where Norm Brafogel was doing the artwork on Detective Comics, and his Batman, those comics are classics. They're just great. I loved them when they were coming out, and they're just as beautiful now. So we're getting reprints of those. Also in this volume, another reason why this particular series is so great is that it prints every Batman comic, I believe, from that era, including graphic novels. So we've got Son of the Demon reprinted in here, which turned out to be a very influential Batman comic. I think I have the original graphic novel somewhere. So the pages are a little smaller than the original graphic novel in this edition, of course, but they look great. They reproduced very well. We also have, 10 Nights of the Beast or something like that storyline, which was a popular storyline by Jim Starlin. That's in here. I mean, this is packed full of great stuff. A great time for Batman the 1980s. So far we've got those two. We've got more Batman coming up, of course, including the Golden Age stuff. That's going to be coming up, I think, next year. Now, Superman started off with the Golden Age stuff. So this starts off in 1938 and goes to 1940. So this has the earliest Superman stories, which have been reprinted quite frequently. But I understand why they started off here with Superman, because this is basically the start of the DC universe of superheroes. This is the beginning of DC Comics' superhero universe. They even call the volume the first superhero. And so I kind of understand why they reprinted this stuff, even though it's been reprinted a million times. Most recently before this in the Golden Age Superman Omnibus. And this volume actually has a big chunk of that. This is over 560 pages. And it's great. So I understand why they started there. They had another Superman book that came out, and that is from the 70s. This has stories from 1970 to 71, including the classic Kryptonite Nevermore story, which is the one story from the 70s you see reprinted quite often. But this volume has all kinds of Superman comics in it. So there are a lot of comics in this particular volume, both before and after the Kryptonite storyline, Kryptonite Nevermore, that have not been reprinted in a long time. So That's fantastic. And that, of course, is one of the things that is so exciting about this line of books, because we're getting stories that, you know, haven't been reprinted. And the stories that have, like Kryptonite Nevermore, they're reprinted in the context of all the other stories that were published around it. So fantastic. I'm hoping they do more of this. I'm hoping that we get more Superman from the early 1980s, some stuff that maybe we haven't seen in a long time. I doubt they'll be doing a lot of the John Byrne era for a while, just because that's been so reprinted. But you never know. I know we're getting more Golden Age stuff from Superman soon. And we'll see where else the series goes. But I can't wait to see it. Wonder Woman. Then we got Wonder Woman. Now, the first Wonder Woman volume they published was this one, which is actually fairly recently for these. This has stories from 2007 to 2009. And this has the Gail Simone Superman stories. And so these are very Superman, Wonder Woman, Gail Simone Wonder Woman stories. And these are a very popular run of stories. There was an omnibus of these, and these are great. So I understand why they started here. But the next volume is interesting because this has stories from 1983 to 1986. So pre-Crisis Wonder Woman stories, the stories that came out right before Crisis, has all kinds of interesting stuff in here. This has some Don Heck Wonder Woman. Don Heck was drawing Wonder Woman for a long, long time. Don Heck, who drew the Avengers back in the 60s and Iron Man back in the 60s and a bunch of other Marvel comics. He moved over to DC and he did a lot of Wonder Woman. And that stuff can be a little hard to find, but here we have it now in this volume. And this looks really interesting. So a bunch of Wonder Woman comics that I have certainly never read. I didn't read Wonder Woman until after Crisis happened. So I missed all of this. So that's kind of exciting. They did an interesting thing when they started publishing Justice League. So this is the Golden Age Justice League, stories by Gardner Fox, but they started in 1966. They didn't start at the beginning of the Justice League. I'm not exactly sure why. There is a volume coming up. I think the next Justice League volume coming up is those original Justice League stories. But they decided to start here with Crisis on Two Earths. And it could be because this does have some original Justice League stories which take place in the multiverse. That could be why they decided to print these particular stories. They're great stories, great Justice League stories. And they look wonderful. So definitely worth a read. So this was the first Justice League volume that came out that has stories from 1966 to 1969. But their next volume was an interesting choice. Their next volume was from the Detroit era of the Justice League, which is not my favorite era of the Justice League. But you know what? I'm looking forward to revisiting this. A lot of people actually love the Detroit era. These are Justice League stories from 1985 to 1987. So this doesn't have the beginning of the Detroit era. It starts a little after that, but it does have the end, I think. This ends at, the tragic end of the Detroit era of Justice League, which was pretty grim. This series of comics had a pretty grim ending going into Crisis on Infinite Earths. So it's interesting. And you have Batman and Aquaman, so there you go. One of the most exciting things that have come out of these is that the Justice Society of America is finally being reprinted in new editions, which we haven't gotten these for a while. And so this has Golden Age Justice Society from 1940 to 1942. A bunch of those old-timey Gardner Fox stories. Gardner Fox wrote Justice Society, and he came back in the 60s to write Justice League. But this is pretty cool. This is pretty cool because I have never read these stories. This was followed up by their second volume, which continues right on from the first. This has stories from 1942 to 1945. So stories right up through World War II. And it looks great. It looks fantastic. I can't wait to read these. And wonderful that they're reprinting these. They look fantastic. They did a really nice job on these. Then we get some other interesting things. Of course, we get the Flash. A lot of the stuff in this volume was reprinted in the Silver Age Flash Omnibus, but not everything. There are actually a few pages in here that are not in the Omnibus. And it's not quite as big as the Omnibus, of course. But the Flash in 1956 ushered in the Silver Age of comics. So the Flash is actually a really important character. And that origin story that starts off this volume is a really important story. These stories written by Gardner Fox. And who else did the writing on here? Does it even say? I think Broom did some stories in here. Yeah, so it was Broom and Fox. And Carmen Infantino did a lot of the artwork. And so, yeah, this is a must-have, The Flash. I love The Flash. He's like my second favorite DC Comics superhero after Superman. Great character. We also have some oddities. This just came out recently. This is Blue Beetle. Now, Blue Beetle was not, at the time that these particular stories were published, a DC character. DC Comics bought Blue Beetle later on. These were Charlton. Were these Charlton comics? I think they were. Let me see. You think it would say on one of the covers. But this has, yeah, Charlton Comics. This has some of the Steve Ditko Blue Beetle stories. So Steve Ditko left Marvel Comics, left Spider-Man to do Blue Beetle. And I have never read a lot of these Blue Beetle comic books. And so this will be my first opportunity to read this stuff. I've kind of thumbed through it. The artwork looks good. It's not as good as his Spider-Man stuff, that's for sure. And some of the Blue Beetle stories before Ditko gets on board, the artwork is questionable in those stories. But I look forward to reading those. So this has the Blue Beetle stuff that was published in the 1960s. And this goes all through the 1960s, and it has one story from 1981, which was the last story that was published before DC bought Blue Beetle, or bought the Charlton characters. I'm hoping this means that the 1980s run of Blue Beetle will be reprinted in DC Finest sometime soon, because I kind of like that series. I would love to read it again in a nice edition. Also, we have Superman Family. So this is awesome. Stories from 1960 to 1961. And Superman Family has all kinds of different comics in it. It's got adventure comics, Superboy comics, Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane, and Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen. So all kinds of great comics in this volume, including The Giant Turtle Man, which is a classic Jimmy Olsen story. So that's awesome. One interesting thing they did was Peacemaker. The Peacemaker television show has been a big hit, so they had to reprint all of the various appearances of Peacemaker from when he was published in Charlton until and then when he got to DC and all the various DC comics he showed up in. One odd thing when you're reading this is that there's no dance number in the beginning. You'd expect there to be dancing. And there's a big lack of Eagly in this, which is sad. And Vigilante is in this, but he's not funny. So there's that. Otherwise, this is pretty good. It's better than I thought it would be because there's all kinds of interesting things in here. And it's fun seeing the direction this character took in the comic books, particularly if you like the show. And then we have Superboy. I was very excited to get this because Superboy is a character who I've never read a lot of his stories because we haven't had a volume like this of just Superboy stories. And this has stories from 54 through 55. So I was thrilled that we get Superboy and Crypto, of course. So a bunch of great 1960s Silver Age Superboy stories that I could finally read. So that's nice. And we got some great Aquaman stories from the Silver Age. So originally DC Comics a few years ago announced that they were coming out with a Silver Age Aquaman omnibus, which they never put out, which sucked. But finally, all that material is out in color, in a nice edition, because of DC Finest. See, DC Finest is awesome. So we get all of these great old Aquaman stories. Some of them aren't so great, but we get all of these Aquaman stories that I never had a chance to read because, you know, I was never able to find the original comics and I didn't have any reprints, but now we have it. So another great reason why this series is so awesome. This is an interesting thing they're doing in that they're doing DC Finest volumes on genres. So they've got science fiction, they're coming out with a war volume, which I really look forward to. They're coming out with a horror volume, which I really look forward to. And this is their science fiction volume, The Gorilla World, which has a bunch of comics from Strange Adventures, Mystery in Space, and some Action Comics stories that had Captain Comet. And so a bunch of science fiction from their science fiction anthologies. And it's some awesome stuff, you know, stuff that has not been reprinted for years. And some of this stuff probably has never been reprinted. So, you know, good job on DC to finally put a lot of this stuff out. I'm looking forward to reading this, and I'm looking forward to those other volumes. They're also apparently doing a line on events. So comic book events are just an inescapable part of comic books and have been since Crisis on Infinite Earths. And I'm kind of surprised that their first event series wasn't Crisis. I think that's the next one they're doing, but they started off with 0 Hour. And basically what they did with these 2 volumes in 0 Hour is they just split up the 0 Hour omnibus, I think, and just put them in 2 DC Finest volumes. This was not my favorite DC event, although there was some good stuff in it, and the main series is illustrated by Jerry Ordway, who is one of the greatest comic book artists of all time. So there's that. Jerry Ordway is amazing, and he does great work on 0 Hour. It's interesting because Crisis on Infinite Earths just screwed up DC continuity. They wanted to restart DC continuity and try to make things make more sense, but really it just made everything make less sense. So much so that only a few years later, they felt like they had to do the whole thing again. And then we got 0 Hour. And we got 2 volumes. There's volume 1, and we've got volume 2. And they gave you a little timeline in the back of the last issue of 0 Hour, so you could like figure out when everything happened in the DC universe, which of course is all out of date now, all out of date now because these stories are from 1994. But it'll be interesting to revisit that. We've got the Suicide Squad from the 80s. We've got Suicide Squad issues from 1986 through 1988. This actually, interestingly, reprints the entire Legends miniseries. So the whole of Legends is reprinted in here, which is interesting. Every single issue of the Legends event, which followed Crisis and was written and illustrated by John Byrne. Not my favorite event, but it does give you the beginnings of the Suicide Squad. And this looks like a really good volume. The Suicide Squad became a big deal, and this has stories from many different comics. It has Suicide Squad 1 through 10, but then you also get stuff from Detective Comics and Firestorm and all kinds of other stuff. So this looks like an interesting book. We've got Harley Quinn. Harley Quinn has become a popular character, so I guess you have to have Harley Quinn, who originated in the cartoon, the Batman animated series. And so, interestingly, the first story in here is actually from Batman Adventures, which was a comic book based on the Batman cartoon, which was actually a pretty good comic book. So we have that. we have a few issues of Batman Adventures, I think, until we get actually the official, I think it was the official entrance of Harley Quinn in the DC Universe in this story. So that's kind of cool. Harley Quinn, never my favorite comic, but, you know, it'll be interesting to read this stuff. Nice, big, thick collection. This is particularly great, the Doom Patrol, one of the greatest comic books from the 1960s from DC. The Doom Patrol was just so terribly weird. It was just such a weird and wonderful comic book. And this has stories from 1963 to 1966. And it has a good chunk of the Silver Age Doom Patrol omnibus. There is going to be another edition, DC Finest edition of Doom Patrol, that's coming out soon, which carries on from this one, called The Death of the Doom Patrol. Spoiler alert. And so that'll have the rest of the Silver Age stuff and going into the Bronze Age stuff, I think. But the Doom Patrol is wonderful, so of course I'm happy to see that. The Teen Titans arrived in this volume, the Judas Contract, one of the more popular runs on the Teen Titans. This was enormously popular back in the early 80s. So this has stories from 83 to 84, and it looks beautiful because it has George Perez artwork. And yeah, it's got all kinds of cool stuff in here, it looks like. So look forward to reading this again because I haven't, read any of these comics since the 1980s. Then we have more Golden Age stuff with Plastic Man. This is the origin of Plastic Man with stories from 41 through 44. And I have never read a lot of these. I think I've read the very first Plastic Man story in some DC Comics Origins of volume. But most of these stories I've never read. So it'll be great to read these finally. Plastic Man and these old Plastic Man stories are kind of legendary, so I look forward to that. And then we get here a couple volumes of Catwoman. And these are the stories from the 80s, the late 80s, starting with 1988, going into the 90s. And this is a popular run on Catwoman when she had her own comic. And a lot of these I never read. This has like the showcase issues and has her comics when she got her own comic book. And so I haven't read these for a long, long time. And that was followed up by another Catwoman volume, which continues on right from that last one. This goes up through 1996. So that's cool. We've had one Legion of Superheroes volume so far. It didn't start where I expected it to start. You would think that they would start with the origin of the Legion, but they don't. This has stories from 1968 all the way through 1974. So these are a bunch of stories which some of them have been reprinted and some of them have not for a long time. This has a lot of the Jim Shooter stories, Jim Shooter who recently passed away. And no matter what you thought of that guy, he had a tremendous influence on comic books. And this is where he started, on the Legion. And these are actually a lot of Legion. There's a lot of Legion stories in here I haven't read. So this will be an interesting volume to dive into. And I'm wondering where they're going to go next with their printing of the Legion. I'm guessing they're probably going to go to the origin of the Legion in the next volume. But I could be wrong. Then we got Supergirl. Lovely volume of Supergirl stories from 1959 to 1962. And I never picked up the Supergirl Silver Age Omnibus when it came out, so I was very happy to get this one. A bunch of Silver Age stories from Supergirl. And we're getting another Supergirl volume fairly soon, which is going to have the Peter David run. The late, great Peter David. So that'll be interesting to see. Green Lantern. This is the only Green Lantern volume so far, although another one's going to be coming out soon. This is Silver Age Green Lantern, but again, they did not start with the origin of the Silver Age Green Lantern. This starts a little later. This has stories from 1963 to 1965. Not sure why they decided to go later, but this does have some great Green Lantern stories. Great Silver Age Green Lantern stories. So no complaints there. Then we got Green Arrow, and they started just where you would figure they would start, with the Longbow Hunters, which is by far the most popular and well-received Green Arrow story, the Longbow Hunters. And this era from 1987 to 1988 was really popular for Green Arrow. And again, a bunch of stories which I haven't read since they first came out, I don't believe, which was a long time ago. It's been a while since the 80s. So I was 16 and 17 years old when this run came out. And I haven't read all of these either. So that'll be fun. We got a Batgirl volume, but it's a Batgirl volume that's late. So this is 2000 to 2002. So this is a version of Batgirl, which is not my favorite version of Batgirl. Barbara Gordon was Batgirl for me. But at this point in time, Barbara Gordon was Oracle. So we had to have another Batgirl. And I've read a few of these, but most of these I haven't read. So I should give this a read and see what I really think of it nowadays. And I will sometime when I have the time. Then we have Metamorpho, who was recently in the new Superman movie and has been a popular character. He's kind of a cult character in DC. The readers who read Metamorpho love Metamorpho. So it's cool that these old Metamorpho stories are being reprinted again. And this has all the Metamorpho stories all the way from 1964 up through 1972. So it's a good-sized book, 592 pages, full of Metamorpho. And so you could see Metamorpho's origins in comic books in this volume. So this should be fun. I like Metamorpho a lot. Then we've got team-ups. This has stories from The Brave and the Bold, and also from DC Comics Presents. So it has Superman team-up stories and Batman team-up stories. And it looks like that's how this series is going to run. And so it reprints a bunch of stories from 78 to 79. It looks like a great volume. I look forward to more of those. That's everything that's been printed up to this point. There are a lot of cool volumes coming up where they're just continuing with some great stuff. More Batman, more Superman. We're getting like that War volume that I mentioned. And I also hear that they're going to be coming out with one dedicated to Sergeant Rock, which is something I've been asking for forever, is for Sergeant Rock to get his own volume. He's needed to have his stories reprinted for a long time. Such a great character. All of that DC War stuff is great. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to the horror volume. Deadman is showing up in his own DC Finest volume. I'm a little confused as to why Swamp Thing has not showed up in DC Finest yet. It seems like that would be a character that would be a natural for this series. And so I expect Swamp Thing to show up eventually. I mean, we have Jack Kirby's The Demon is getting a volume. So if The Demon can get a volume, definitely Swamp Thing can get a volume. There are a lot of characters that should show up in DC Finest. The Phantom's coming out. I mean, pretty much everything that I would want. Not the Phantom. The Phantom, is it the Phantom Stranger? No, it's the Spectre. The Spectre is who I was thinking of. The Spectre is getting a volume. The Phantom Stranger should get a volume. So hopefully we'll get the Phantom Stranger sometime. But it's been great. This series of books has been everything I have wanted it to be. This is what I wanted DC to do for years. And finally they're doing it. And they're doing it so well. They're just doing a bang-up job reprinting all of this great old stuff that, I and a lot of others have been wanting to see forever. I will shut up because this is a very long video. Good job, DC. I will catch you next time.